The 5 tiers came down at 3:47 on a Saturday afternoon in June. The top tier went first. It split against the baseboard of the display table and sent a long streak of white frosting across the dark walnut floor. The second and third tiers followed together, folding into each other the way something tired finally gives up. The fourth tier rolled, a full quarter turn across the hardwood before it came to rest against the leg of a gilt chair. The bottom tier, the widest, the heaviest, dropped straight down and sat in the wreckage like a headstone. And at the center of all of it stood a man in plain clothes, holding a 2.5-year-old girl whose fingers were covered in white frosting and whose face showed no awareness that anything had gone wrong. Vivian Ashcroft reached them before the last piece had stopped sliding. She crossed the ballroom in 4 strides. The heel of her left shoe cracked against the hardwood so sharply that a caterer near the service entrance flinched. She did not stop at a conversational distance. She stopped close enough that Nolan Price could smell the gardenia on her jacket, and she put her hand flat against his chest and she pushed, not hard, but publicly, in front of 43 people standing among white linen and hydrangeas, waiting for a ceremony that was supposed to start in less than an hour. "You need to leave," she said, "right now. You need to take that child and leave this property before I call the police." Nolan did not step back. He shifted Zuri to his other hip. He looked at the frosting on the floor, and then he looked at Vivian Ashcroft, and he said nothing at all. She reached for her phone, and then the double doors to the estate kitchen swung open, and a man in a white chef's coat walked through them, pushing a rolling cart. On that cart sat 6 tiers of ivory buttercream and hand-sculpted sugar peonies and a cascade of edible gold leaf that caught the afternoon light from the ballroom windows and held it. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. If you are watching this right now, and something about this story already has you leaning in, drop your city in the comments before we go any further. I want to know where you are watching from. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the kind of story we tell here every single week. People who get overlooked. People who do the work anyway. Hit subscribe, ring that bell and stay with me, because what Vivian Ashcroft was about to learn about the man she had just put her hands on is going to stay with you long after this video ends. Nolan Price built things that outlasted the rooms they were carried into. He had understood this about his work for a long time, and the people close to him had come to understand it about him too. His silence was not absence, it was attention. He was always paying attention. He just didn't feel the need to announce it. He was a pastry chef, not the kind who worked a hotel banquet line piping rosettes on retirement cakes, though he had done that too, for 3 years at the Marriott on Clarendon Boulevard in Arlington, when he was 24, and still paying off culinary school loans. He was the kind of pastry chef who built structures, wedding cakes that weighed 60 pounds and held their shape through 9 hours of Virginia humidity, sugar flowers so thin you could see light through the petals, isomalt sculptures that looked like glass and tasted like nothing because they were not made to be eaten, they were made to be seen. He had trained at the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, graduated second in his pastry cohort, and spent 2 years afterwards staging at a patisserie in Lyon called Maison Claret, where the head chef spoke to him in French he barely understood, and threw away anything that didn't meet a standard Nolan couldn't yet name, but could feel in his hands. He came back to the States leaner and quieter than when he left. He opened a studio in a rented commercial kitchen in Falls Church, Virginia. He called it Price Confections. He started taking commissions. That was 9 years ago. In those 9 years, he had built cakes for a congressional fundraiser, 2 embassy receptions, a feature in Bon Appetit's annual wedding issue, and a private event at the Kennedy Center that he was asked not to discuss publicly and never did. Editors at magazines whose names his own mother didn't recognize could describe the exact shade of ivory he used on a Cascade tier from 3 seasons back. None of this was visible when you looked at him. He drove a 2014 Honda Accord with a car seat in the back and a thin crack across the lower right corner of the windshield he had been meaning to fix for 11 months. He kept his beard trimmed close. He carried Zuri on his left hip because his right shoulder had never fully recovered from a fall he took in the Maison Claret kitchen when he slipped on a wet floor carrying a tray of choux and caught himself badly against a stainless steel counter. His wife's name was Simone. She had been a ceramicist, not a hobbyist, a working artist who threw pots on a Brent CXC wheel in a studio behind their house and sold them through a gallery in DuPont Circle, and at a twice-yearly show in Staunton she had done every October and April since she was 27. Her hands were always dry from the clay. She kept a tin of bag balm on the windowsill above the kitchen sink and rubbed it into her knuckles every night after Zuri was asleep. And the smell of it had lived in that house so persistently that Nolan could still catch it, sometimes when the heat kicked on in winter and moved air through rooms that hadn't been opened in a while. She died 19 months ago, pulmonary embolism. She was 31 years old, and she was at the grocery store buying the yellow split peas that Nolan used in a soup he made on Sundays. And she was on the floor of aisle 9 before anyone understood what was happening. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. It was not enough. Nolan did not talk about it, not to his mother, who flew up from Raleigh and stayed for 3 weeks and cooked every meal and folded every piece of laundry, and still couldn't get him to say more than "she's gone and I need to figure out the rest." Not to his colleague and friend Reginald Tate, who had worked alongside him for 6 years and had been the one to call the florist and the funeral home and the studio landlord when Nolan couldn't hold a phone without his hands shaking. Not to anyone. What he did instead was this. Every morning before Zuri woke up, he went to the kitchen and pulled down a ceramic mug from the top shelf. It was wide and low, and the glaze on it was a blue-green that Simone had mixed herself from a recipe she kept in a small notebook with a cracked leather cover. The handle was slightly too thick because she had made it in a hurry one Saturday afternoon, while Zuri napped and Nolan was testing a ganache ratio in the kitchen, and she came in with wet clay still on her forearms and said, "Here, this one's yours. It's ugly, but it'll hold coffee." It was not ugly. It was the most specifically beautiful thing he owned. He drank his coffee from it every morning and washed it by hand and returned it to the same spot on the shelf and never once explained to anyone why. Zuri was 2 years and 7 months old. She had Simone's hands. That was the thing people said first, before they said anything else. Wide across the palm, with fingers that reached for surfaces the way Simone's always had. She touched everything: the wall beside her car seat when Nolan buckled her in, the edge of the table at the diner where they ate breakfast on Saturdays, the face of the woman behind the dry cleaner counter who leaned down to say hello and found a small palm pressed flat against her cheek. She had a word for cake. She called it ka. She had been saying it since she was 14 months old, since the first time Nolan let her sit on the studio counter while he worked, and she watched him smooth a crumb coat on a practice tier and reached for it with both hands, and he caught her wrists gently and said, "Nobi, not yet." And she said, "Kuh," and he laughed for what might have been the first time in weeks. She said it now whenever she saw anything frosted, anything layered, anything white and smooth that looked like the things her father built. She said it at the bookstore when she saw a birthday cake on the cover of a children's book. She said it at the bakery when they passed the display case. She said it at the Langford estate on a Saturday afternoon in June when she saw 5 tiers of white fondant sitting on a table in a ballroom where nobody was watching her. The morning of the wedding, Nolan's alarm went off at 4:15. He lay in the dark for 11 seconds, the way he always did. Then he got up. He filled the blue-green mug with coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen counter while he reviewed the timeline he had written in a small spiral notebook the night before. Delivery to Langford Estate, PM assembly on site 1:15 to 2:30, final detailing 2:30 to 3:15. The ceremony was at 4:30. He had planned for a 90-minute cushion between his last touch on the cake and the moment guests would see it. Reg called at 6:40 while Nolan was feeding Zuri oatmeal with blueberries in her high chair. "You need me there today?" Reg asked. "I can handle transport. Just need you on call if a tier shifts. It's June in Virginia, Nolan. Humidity's going to be 68% by noon. You sure you don't want a second pair of hands on the assembly?" "I'll call you if I need you," Nolan, Reg said. And there was a pause that held 6 years of working together, and the particular weight of a man watching his friend carry too much alone. "You know the bride's mother is going to be there." "I know. You know she's the one who tried to cancel the contract." "I know that too." Reg didn't say anything for a moment. "Just don't let Zuri eat the sugar flowers this time," he said, and Nolan almost smiled. The commission had come in 4 months earlier. Claire Ashcroft had found Nolan's work through the Bon Appetit feature. She emailed the studio directly, described what she wanted in specific and passionate detail: a 6-tier cake with hand-sculpted sugar peonies and a cascade of edible gold leaf that referenced the pressed flower art her grandmother had made. and asked for a consultation. Nolan met her at the studio on a Tuesday afternoon. She brought a folder of images and a small framed piece of her grandmother's flower art. And she spoke about it with the kind of love that Nolan understood in his hands before he understood it in words. He quoted her a price. She did not hesitate. Her mother did. Vivian Ashcroft had her own ideas about the wedding cake, as she had her own ideas about the venue, the flowers, the guest list, the string quartet, and the specific shade of ivory that should appear on the table linens. She had already contracted a bakery in Georgetown, a place called Arnaud's that had been making society wedding cakes for 22 years, and whose owner she had met at a junior league luncheon in 2019. When Claire told her she had hired a different baker, Vivian called the studio, Nolan answered. She asked who he was. She asked where he had trained. She asked how long he had been in business. She asked if he was insured. She asked if he had done events at Langford Estate before. She asked each question the way a person asks questions when they are not looking for answers but for reasons to say no. Nolan answered each one, plainly, without elaboration. He did not mention Bon Appetit. He did not mention the Kennedy Center. He did not mention Lyon. He answered what was asked and nothing more. She told him her daughter had made a mistake. She told him she would be contacting Arnaud's to reinstate the original order. She told him, in a voice that carried the particular frequency of a woman accustomed to having her preferences treated as instructions, that his services would not be needed. Nolan said, "Your daughter hired me, and I'll be there on the day she asked me to be there." He hung up. 3 more calls came over the following 2 weeks, each one slightly more pointed than the last. She mentioned liability. She mentioned the estate's vendor approval list. She mentioned once that she had looked at his website and that his studio did not look like the kind of operation that handled events of this caliber. She did not say what she meant by that. She did not have to. Nolan did not respond to the last 2 calls. He let them go to voicemail. He listened to them once each, standing in the kitchen at night while Zuri slept, then deleted them and went back to the sketch he was refining for the sugar peonies. Vivian Ashcroft was not a cruel woman. That was the complicated part. She was a woman who had worked most of her adult life to build and maintain a particular kind of life, a particular standing in a particular world. And she had learned along the way that the price of that standing was vigilance, constant, exhausting vigilance about who belonged and who didn't. She had grown up in a family that had very little, and she had spent 40 years making sure her daughter would not grow up the same way. The things she did with her certainty, the way she wielded her social authority, the speed with which she crossed a room and put her hand on a man's chest, none of it came from nowhere. It came from a fear she had never examined, dressed up as taste. She knew Arnaud's. She had stood in their Georgetown showroom and eaten their samples off silver forks, and felt at home there in a way that required no explanation. She did not know Nolan Price. She had seen his website once. She had made her assessment in a manner she would never, if pressed, have been able to fully articulate. And she had never been pressed. Until now, Claire called Nolan 3 days before the wedding. She was crying. Her mother had pressured Arnaud's to deliver a cake regardless, and they had agreed. There would be 2 cakes at the wedding. Her mother's, from Arnaud's, displayed in the ballroom, and Nolan's, the one Claire had actually wanted, which Claire asked him to keep in the estate kitchen until she was ready to reveal it. Nolan understood. He had understood women like Vivian Ashcroft for a long time. He understood that the fight was not about cake. He told Claire he would be there at 1 p.m. with the tiers boxed and temperature controlled, and that he would assemble in the kitchen and wait, which is exactly what he did. He arrived at Langford Estate at 12:50 with Zuri in the car seat and 6 insulated boxes in the back of the Accord. His babysitter had cancelled that morning, a text at 7:15 that said stomach flu. So sorry, and his mother was in Raleigh, and Reg was at his daughter's softball tournament in Fredericksburg, and there was no one else. So Zuri came with him. She sat in a portable high chair in the corner of the estate kitchen, eating Cheerios from a small plastic cup, while Nolan assembled a cake that represented 4 months of design work and 14 years of training. He worked for 2 hours. The bottom tier alone took 30 minutes. He leveled it with a spirit level he carried in his kit, adjusted the cardboard round beneath it twice, and checked the alignment against the edge of the cart from 4 angles before he was satisfied. He stacked the remaining tiers with wooden dowels cut the night before to precise lengths, each one measured against the height of the tier it would support and sanded smooth so it wouldn't catch against the cake board above it. He applied the final coat of buttercream and smoothed it with a bench scraper he had bought in Lyon and carried with him to every job since. The scraper had a nick in the upper left corner from the time Reg dropped it on the studio floor. Nolan had considered replacing it 3 times and never did because his hand knew that scraper the way a musician knows an instrument that has been played long enough to become part of the playing. He placed 53 hand-sculpted sugar peonies, each one made individually over 3 weeks in the studio while Zuri slept, each one slightly different from the others, because real flowers are never the same twice. The technique was one he had developed himself, a method of pulling and curling gum paste petals over the handle of a wooden spoon to create a curl that mimicked the way a real peony opens in the last days before it drops. Simone had been the one who showed him that years ago, holding an actual peony from the garden and turning it slowly under the kitchen light, while he watched the way each petal folded over the one beneath it. She had not known she was teaching him something he would use for the rest of his career. She had just been holding a flower. He applied the gold leaf with a squirrel hairbrush that cost $90 and that he cleaned after every use with the same care Simone had cleaned her pottery tools. At 3:20 the cake was finished. It sat on the rolling cart in the estate kitchen, 6 tiers of ivory buttercream and sugar flowers and edible gold, and it was the best work Nolan had ever done. The kitchen staff, 3 of them, had stopped what they were doing to look at it. One of them, a woman in her 50s who had been plating appetizers, said something in Spanish to the woman beside her, and the woman beside her nodded slowly. Nolan texted Claire, "It's ready. Kitchen. Whenever you want it," Claire replied in seconds after the ceremony. "I want it to be the first thing people see at the reception. Mom's cake is in the ballroom. Let her have it for now." Nolan wiped his hands on a clean towel. He picked up Zuri. He walked out of the kitchen into the hallway connecting to the back of the ballroom because he needed to check the humidity level in the room where his cake would eventually be displayed. He did not intend to be in that ballroom for more than 30 seconds. He stepped through the service entrance. He held Zuri and looked at the thermostat panel near the door. 64 degrees, 59% humidity, acceptable. And then Zuri saw the cake, not his cake, Vivian Ashcroft's cake, the Arnaud's cake. 5 tiers of white fondant with piped borders and silk flowers, sitting on a round table in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by votive candles and a ring of white roses. "Cool," Zuri said. Nolan turned to leave, but Zuri had already extended her arm. She had Simone's reach, that specific forward lean of the torso Simone used when something on a shelf was just beyond her fingertips, and Nolan felt Zuri's weight shift on his hip, and he adjusted. But his right shoulder, the bad one, seized for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, Zuri leaned far enough forward to press her palm flat against the second tier of the Arnaud's cake and push. Gravity did the rest. Vivian Ashcroft was standing near the gift table when she heard the sound. She turned. She saw a black man in plain clothes holding a toddler in the middle of 5 destroyed tiers of wedding cake, and she did not pause to ask a single question. She crossed that floor. She put her hand on his chest. She raised her voice loud enough for every caterer, every florist, every early arriving guest to hear, and she said the things she said. "Call the police," she told the wedding coordinator, who came running from the foyer. "He brought a child into this venue and destroyed my daughter's wedding cake. I want him removed. I want him arrested." The wedding coordinator, a woman named Dana who had been doing events at Langford Estate for 11 years, looked at Nolan. She looked at the cake on the floor. She looked at Vivian Ashcroft, whose face had taken on the specific flush of a woman who believes she is witnessing the confirmation of something she suspected all along. Nolan held Zuri. He watched Vivian the way a person watches weather they have been expecting for a long time. Zuri looked at Vivian Ashcroft's face. She studied it with the calm, unblinking attention that only very small children can sustain without embarrassment. Then she looked up at her father. "Why is she loud?" Zuri asked. Nolan did not answer right away. He looked at his daughter's face, at the frosting still on her fingers, at the wide-open seriousness in her eyes. "Some people get scared," he said quietly. "When something breaks." Zuri considered this. She looked back at Vivian. "She can have one of yours," Zuri said. "Daddy makes better ones anyway." The room went very still. Not the held breath stillness of the collision a minute ago, but something different. Something that moved through the air the way a change in weather moves before the rain actually arrives. A few people near the windows exchanged glances. One of the caterers pressed a hand briefly to her mouth. Dana, the wedding coordinator, looked down at her clipboard and did not look back up. Vivian Ashcroft opened her mouth, and then the kitchen doors opened. Reginald Tate walked through them wearing his chef's coat, the one with his name embroidered over the left breast, pushing the rolling cart. On it sat the cake, 6 tiers, 53 sugar peonies, each one slightly different from the next. Gold leaf caught in the afternoon light the way real gold catches it, which is to say completely, without apology, in a way that made it difficult to look anywhere else. Reg had driven from the softball tournament in Fredericksburg. He had texted Nolan at 2:45. "I'm coming anyway, don't argue," and Nolan had not argued, and Reg had arrived at the estate kitchen at 3:30 and been standing with the cake for 20 minutes waiting. Claire Ashcroft appeared behind him. She was in her wedding dress. Her eyes were red. She had heard the commotion from the bridal suite upstairs. She looked at her mother. She looked at the destroyed cake on the floor. She looked at Nolan, holding Zuri frosting on his shirt. "That," she said, pointing to the wreckage on the floor, "was your cake, Mom." She turned to the 6 tiers on the cart. "This is mine. This is the one I chose. He made it, Nolan Price. The man you have been trying to get rid of for 4 months. The ballroom was very quiet. Nolan looked at Vivian Ashcroft. He did not look at her with anger. He did not look at her with triumph. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone when he has known for a long time how this would go and is simply watching it arrive. "Your daughter has good taste," he said. That was all. Reg put his hand on Nolan's shoulder, the good one, and squeezed once. And then he began positioning the cart where the display table had been, stepping carefully over the fondant wreckage, doing the work the way he and Nolan had always done the work, which was without waiting for permission, and without asking for applause. Vivian Ashcroft stood in the middle of her daughter's ballroom and watched a cake she had never approved of take the place of the one she had chosen. Her hands, which had been so certain a moment ago, hung at her sides like they belonged to someone she didn't recognize. 2 guests near the window were whispering. A caterer was already sweeping. Zuri was wiping frosting from her fingers onto Nolan's collar, methodically, 1 finger at a time, the way her mother used to wipe clay from her hands onto the apron she kept hanging by the studio door. Vivian drove home while the reception was still going. She took Route 7 instead of the highway because it was longer and she was not ready to arrive anywhere. She pulled into her driveway in Great Falls and turned off the engine and sat in the car with her hands on the steering wheel. She thought about the phone calls, all 4 of them. She thought about what she had said to her daughter about the studio, about the website, about the kind of operation that didn't look like the kind of operation. She thought about what she had meant when she said that. She had never finished that sentence, because the sentence, finished, would have required her to hear it. She thought about the way she had crossed that ballroom floor, the speed of it, the certainty. She thought about her hand against his chest and the specific pressure she had used, which was not hard enough to move a man his size, but was hard enough to tell every person in that room what she believed about who he was and what right he had to be there. She thought about the child's face. The girl had not been scared. That was the thing Vivian kept returning to. Sitting alone in her car in the dark, the girl had not been scared of her. She had looked up with mild, open curiosity and said, "Why is she loud?" And then she had said, "Daddy makes better ones anyway," in the same tone a child uses when they are simply telling the truth about something they know to be true, without strategy, without cruelty, without any awareness that the truth could land the way it had landed. She had not been scared because her father had not been scared. And he had not been scared because he had known, the entire time, something Vivian had not. He had known what he was carrying, he had known what he had built, and he had known that the woman shouting at him in a ballroom full of strangers was standing next to the proof of everything she had refused to believe about him. Vivian sat in her car for 40 minutes. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who did that, not in cars, not alone. She turned on the porch light with the app on her phone. She went inside. She poured a glass of water and drank it standing at the counter and put the glass in the dishwasher and stood there for a moment with her hand on the counter's edge, gripping it, the way a person grips something when the ground has shifted and they need to know that at least one surface is where they left it. She was not sorry yet. She was something before sorry, something that did not have a name and that she could not have described if someone had asked. But she knew that the shape of the day she had just lived through would not leave her, and she knew that the shape of it was her fault, And she knew that knowing this was only the beginning of what she was going to have to carry. Nolan cleaned the frosting off Zuri's hands in the estate bathroom with paper towels and warm water. Zuri said cuff 3 more times during the process. Nolan said, "Yeah, baby, I know." He drove home with the windows down because June in Virginia smells like cut grass and warm asphalt, and he had learned, in the 19 months since Simone died, that specific smells at specific times could hold him in the present when his mind wanted to go somewhere else. Reg called while Nolan was pulling into the driveway. "Claire says the guests can't stop talking about the cake," Reg said. "3 people asked for your card. The groom's mother wants to commission you for her anniversary in October." Nolan unbuckled Zuri from her car seat. She was already half asleep. "Also, Reg said you have buttercream on your ear." Nolan reached up. He did. There was a pause on the line. "You could have said something to her," Reg said, and his voice shifted into the register of a man who has watched his friend absorb things that should not have to be absorbed in the ballroom. "You could have told her who you were, all of it. The Kennedy Center. Bon appetit, Leon. You could have ended it in 30 seconds. "I did say something," Nolan said. "You said Claire has good taste." "That's enough," Nolan said. Reg was quiet for a moment. "Simone would have told her off," he said. "She would have taken the cake spatula and directed traffic." Nolan carried Zuri up the porch steps. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." He put Zuri to bed. He pulled off her shoes, the small canvas ones with the Velcro straps, and set them beside the crib. He pulled the blanket to her chest. She was asleep before he finished. She slept the way Simone had slept, on her left side with one hand open near her face, palm up, as if she were waiting for someone to place something in it. He went to the kitchen. He washed the blue-green mug that had been sitting in the dish rack since morning. He dried it and put it back on the top shelf. He stood at the counter and ate a bowl of cereal because he had not eaten since 6 a.m., and his body was only now telling him. On Tuesday, a letter arrived from the Langford Estates event coordinator, brief and professional. It thanked him for his work and informed him that 3 guests had submitted private event inquiries referencing his name, and that the estate would like to add him to their preferred vendor list. Enclosed was a check for the full commission amount, plus a gratuity that was larger than the commission itself. Nolan put the check in the desk drawer where he kept his business records. He put the letter in the folder where he kept client correspondence. He closed the drawer and went back to the kitchen where Zuri was sitting on the floor, stacking plastic cups into a tower and knocking them down and laughing each time they fell with a satisfaction that seemed bottomless. "Daddy," she said, which was a word she had only recently started using with that particular confidence, as if she had finally decided it was a word worth keeping. "Daddy, kuh. There's no cake right now, baby." "Kuh," she said again, and pointed at the counter where a mixing bowl sat with dried batter from a test batch he had started the night before. He looked at her. She looked at him. She had frosting under one fingernail that he had missed during the estate cleanup, somehow surviving 2 baths and a full night's sleep. "You want to help me make something?" he asked. She held up both hands, Simone's hands. It was Thursday when Vivian Ashcroft came to the door. Nolan saw her through the front window before she knocked. She was holding a ceramic pot with a rosemary plant in it, and she was standing on his porch with the posture of a woman who has rehearsed what she came to say and already knows that what she rehearsed will not be what comes out. He opened the door. She held out the rosemary. "I thought you might use this," she said, "for cooking. My neighbor grows them and she had an extra." Nolan looked at the plant. He looked at Vivian. She was wearing different clothes than the ones at the estate. She looked smaller in them. He took the pot from her hands. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She nodded. She opened her mouth and then she closed it. The sentence she had rehearsed was somewhere behind her teeth and it was not going to come out today. That was clear. She was a woman standing on a porch holding nothing now, and the nothing was heavier than the plant had been. Zuri appeared in the hallway behind Nolan. She walked to the door with the specific unsteady confidence of a child who has recently decided that walking is available to her at all times and intends to use it. She looked up at Vivian. Vivian looked down at her. Zuri studied her for a moment. Then she reached forward and touched the hem of Vivian's jacket with 2 fingers. Not a greeting, not affection, just the same tactile curiosity she brought to every surface she encountered. She rubbed the fabric once between her fingertips, and then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen without a word. Vivian watched her go. Something passed across her face that was too quick and too complicated to name. She looked at Nolan. She's beautiful, Vivian said. She is, Nolan said. He did not invite her in. He did not close the door in her face. He stood in the space between those two choices, the way he stood in every space, which was with patience and without performance, and with the understanding that some things take the time they take. Thank you for the rosemary, he said. She nodded once. She turned and walked back to her car. She did not look back. She did not need to. The walk itself was enough, and the plant was on his counter now. And the rest of it, whatever the rest of it would be, was going to happen on a timeline that neither of them controlled. That night, after Zuri was asleep, Nolan stood in the kitchen and repotted the rosemary into one of Simone's ceramic planters. It was a small one, round, with a glaze that was not quite brown and not quite red, and that Simone had called umber, even though Nolan always thought it looked more like the color of coffee when you add just enough milk to change it. He set the planter on the windowsill above the sink. He moved the bag balm tin to the left to make room. The rosemary fit. Not perfectly, but it fit. He washed his hands. He dried them on the towel hanging from the oven handle. He filled the blue-green mug with water and set it in the sink for the morning. Then he walked down the hallway and stood in the doorway of Zuri's room and watched her sleep. She was on her left side. Her hand was open near her face. He listened to her breath and counted the breaths the way he counted everything, precisely, without rushing, with the particular attention of a man who has learned that the things you measure are the things you keep. He pulled the door almost closed, not all the way. He left a gap of 3 inches because Zuri did not like the dark, and because the hallway light reached her floor through that gap, and made a shape that she had once pointed at and called moon, and that Nolan had never corrected because she was right, in a way that mattered more than accuracy. He turned off the kitchen light. He checked the lock on the front door. He set his alarm for 4:15. Tomorrow there would be a new commission to sketch, a sugar peony technique he wanted to refine, a grocery run, a call from his mother, a morning in the studio with Zuri in the portable high chair, eating Cheerios and watching him work with eyes that were starting to understand what she was watching. The thermos was on the counter where he always left it. He unscrewed the cap and filled it with coffee from the pot he had brewed after dinner, the way he did every night so it would be ready and cold. By morning, the way Simone had taught him because she said hot coffee at 4 a.m. is a promise but cold coffee is a decision. And Nolan had never fully understood what she meant by that, but he kept doing it because the ritual was hers and keeping it was his. He placed the thermos by the front door. He turned off the last light. The house was quiet. Somewhere in it a child was breathing, and a rosemary plant was sitting in a dead woman's planter, and a man was choosing, as he chose every single day, to begin again in the morning.